Uh-huh. Yeah, well, that looks kind of bad.
I know, that's what I keep telling them.
Yeah. Look, even the tile is falling apart. Yeah.
Tony Curtis was an odd choice to play the killer, the Boston Strangler. But it's an absolutely masterful performance, way against type. It's an incredible movie. I mean, it holds up today. You could run that picture today. While the film has a documentary style in a way, there are many liberties taken for dramatic purposes, I guess. But it's also a great screenplay, and it helps you to understand the schizophrenia, the severe schizophrenia of this mass murderer.
Oh, yeah, I can see the leak.
I desperately wanted to direct The Boston Strangler, but I had very little experience at the time, and I knew the producer, Robert Fryer, and his assistant, James Cresson, who owned the rights to the Strangler book, and they wanted me very much. They lobbied for me to direct that film, but Zanuck would have none of it. He went to the go-to guy who was the Fox Pro, Richard Fleischer, who did an absolutely great job with this film. So I have that peripheral connection with it via Tony Curtis and via the producers who wanted me to direct it because they wanted sort of a young person's approach to it. What they got from Fleischer was not only a contemporary approach, but with the experience of one of Hollywood's best professional directors. So it was a combination of great storytelling and even experimental storytelling in this case by a solid pro. It's still an enormously effective movie. It scares me. I haven't seen it for a while, but I remember it vividly.
I called you 15 minutes ago and they still aren't here. I told you before. I'm a nurse. 3 of those women were nurses. This man has been here 3 nights in a row, peeking. Please, thank you.
The Boston Strangler is one of the best thrillers ever made. It was about an actual case that terrorized the city of Boston and the whole United States. Between 1962 and 1964, there were 13 women killed. Someone had been admitted to the apartments of various women who were strangled, presumably by the same man, who became known as the Boston Strangler. The film that Fleischer made of this, from a very important best-selling book about the Strangler case by a man named Gerold Frank, that was later adopted by one of Hollywood's best screenwriters, Edward Anhalt, is, in my view, a masterpiece, virtually flawless. It took a lot of liberties with the truth because the truth was not completely known at the time they made the film. And it's only in recent years that other things have been discovered about it. But that book by Gerold Frank and that film by Fleischer became the definitive story of Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. Fleischer does show you DeSalvo's wife and 2 kids. He's a normal family man. He worked in a rubber plant. In the movie, they have him working in a furniture manufacturing factory. I don't know why they changed it to a rubber plant. But DeSalvo was a guy living a double life, and half of his life was quite normal, while these horrible murders were going on. What they don't mention in the film was what came out in Gerold Frank's book, that one of DeSalvo's kids had a pelvic disorder. And DeSalvo, who was a very good father and husband, used to tie a double knot on his daughter's pelvis, which would contain the flow of blood and ease her pain. And it was that knot that he used on his daughter's pelvis that was the strangler knot, found on all of the victims. Whether that was a coincidence or not is not known. Now, another detail that I thought they should have used but didn't, because I was a student of the Strangler murders. The idea that he used to get into women's apartments was from an old and stupid television series called The Bob Cummings Show. It was with this actor, Robert Cummings, who played a professional photographer of models who used to have a tape measure. And he would titillate the models by measuring their breasts and their thighs. And you'd see this in the TV show, and the women would go, oh, and they'd be really turned on by what he was doing. And he used that, and DeSalvo saw that TV show and decided to ring women's doorbells, and over the speaker he would say, I've been told that you're a very interesting woman and might be good to do some modeling. Would you be interested in making some extra money, doing some modeling? Nothing sexual, clothes, whatever. And in 1,000 or more cases, the women would let him in. And in several hundred of those cases, he would go in, take out a little tape measure, and start measuring the women. Some of them would get turned on, and he would have sex with them. And then some of these women went to the police, and he was first known as the measuring man. And what happened was that later, in his twisted mind, he wasn't getting enough satisfaction from just measuring them and having sex. He started to kill them. Now, that fact that I've told you is not in the movie. I guess, you know, that the code was too restrictive at that time to do that sort of thing. But they do have DeSalvo, played by Tony Curtis, get into women's apartments claiming he's a repairman or he's there to fix the pipes, the toilet, the bath, whatever, and they'd let him in and he would strangle them. They ultimately caught DeSalvo, but only accidentally. He was caught and later charged with these 13 murders. The film has a kind of a documentary edge to it, but what we now know is that DeSalvo may not have been the only Strangler killer. He may not even have been the killer. Now, that's not in the film. DeSalvo, who was picked up for breaking and entering into a woman's house, never went to trial as the Boston Strangler. That is in the film. He was put into an insane asylum or a mental institution for life because they didn't have enough evidence to convict him. So they decided to put him away as a split personality, schizophrenic, insane guy, which would have kept him in for life, but never charged with the murders. But what happened to him was a few years later, he was killed in the mental institution. None of that is really in the film, but the film is pretty much everything that was known at the time. I think it's a great film and one of the best horror films I've ever seen. The film is really unique. It's so unique that its technique was adapted just a few years ago by one of the most popular television series in America called 24. And that was Fleischer's use of multiple images in the same frame. Now, Fleischer, I guess, has said that he got this idea from seeing an exhibition in Montreal of a World's Fair called Expo 67. And I believe that that was one of the first introductions to the public of IMAX. IMAX, which is what this super widescreen technique was, did in its initial films show various dynamic frames within the larger frame. And Fleischer saw Expo 67 and got the idea to use that technique. Multiple images using, for example, you'd see the Boston Strangler in his car searching out a victim. You'd see the victim in the same frame, not as a cutaway. You would then see other details of that moment fragmented into the same frame.
I take every precaution. No, after 9 o'clock, I'm pretty close to home.
Well, I really think that we should be well protected and have our doors locked, everyone.
And the technique is brilliant. At the time, it was new and very controversial. And the studio was worried about it. Is this going to work? Is this going to take people's focus away from the most important image? It didn't. It enhanced the story as a kind of graphic, almost documentary account of the Strangler murders. It begins with a very small image of an old television set in 1962 and the Voyager mission by Alan Shepard and John Glenn when, they were going into outer space. And on that same day, suddenly in another part of the frame, you begin to get a sense of the first known victim of the Boston Strangler during this event, which was, a worldwide phenomenon. And while that's going on is the event that kicks off the plot of the film. The first hour of the film is mostly spent on showing not the murders, but the aftermath of the murders. You never really see any violence committed, certainly not to the extent that you see it in films today. In a film today, like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or even almost a documentary that resembles The Boston Strangler, the film about the Zodiac Killer, the violence is very graphic. It's not graphic in the Boston Strangler film, and yet it's terrifying. The Boston Strangler is one of the most terrifying films I've ever seen. Henry Fonda's in the film as well. He plays a character named John Bottomley, who was a real character. He was the assistant to the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and he appointed Bottomley, played by Henry Fonda, to head up the Strangler squad. There were many suspects, and a number of the suspects were gay men.
Because I am too vulnerable. If you're rich and gay, people continually harass and blackmail you.
And in The Boston Strangler, very courageously, you see a scene in a gay bar with Hurd Hatfield, who had years before played The Picture of Dorian Gray. And it was really off the beaten path to show a scene in a gay bar and to suggest that a gay man then was a killer of women. But there it is in this movie, wonderfully and subtly portrayed. And this was 2 years before I made Boys in the Band, which was gay men shown in graphic sexual activity out of the
Thus was the life and the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
It takes at least an hour before Fleischer introduces you to Albert DeSalvo, played by Tony Curtis. Curtis is watching the Kennedy funeral cortege, and you see how deeply moved he is at the killing of John F. Kennedy.
In America.
And in a way, it establishes his normalcy.
Don't be sad, Daddy.
A family man married to a German woman, 2 young children. And then later, that same day, DeSalvo goes out and strangles another victim. The performance by Curtis as DeSalvo is one of the great American film performances. At that time, the time he made the film, I was directing a film called The Night They Raided Minsky's. And I hired Tony Curtis for the lead. And I went to meet with him. I was a very young director, and this was my second film. And I went to meet the great Tony Curtis, and he said, look, I like the part, but I don't like the script. Get the writer to put more meat on the bones. That was his phrase. Get some more meat on the bones. And we did a couple of rewrites, and they didn't please Tony, and he took the part in the Boston Strangler instead, which was a great career move, I must say, because it's a great performance, aided by Fleischer's subtle and ingenious direction of this classic, I would say, horror film. Peter Hurkos is the psychic that was brought into the Strangler case, who supposedly had parapsychological abilities, played, I think, by a good character actor named George Voskovec. And the Boston police actually brought him in this wonderful scene where he simply puts his hands on the backs of photographs that they've laid out, and he can tell which photograph contains the victim without looking at it, and which photograph took place in the victim's apartment and which did not, where they were trying to fool him. And for a while, Hurkos led the police to a number of suspects who had very questionable records, but they weren't the Strangler, at least as far as we know. But the police followed a number of Hurkos's leads, and that's depicted in the film very well.
Now, God wants you to tell us the truth. God knows how you've been hurt, and he wants you to tell us the truth. God wants your salvation as much as you do, huh? Now, tell us the truth.
George Kennedy plays the lead detective, whose name was DiNatale, who was the lead detective in the Strangler killings. All of the characters who play the victim and the cops are brilliantly and subtly directed by Fleischer.
I want to go back to the day of the president's funeral. You remember what you did that day?
In the last 20 minutes, when Bottomley, played by Henry Fonda, is questioning DeSalvo about the murders, Fleischer uses quick subliminal cuts of the murders, which he's earlier shown you.
What's the matter? I saw something.
You see hands going around a woman's neck. You see a woman's face. You see details, which I later used in The Exorcist, that technique of subliminal cuts. While DeSalvo is describing the murders to Bottomley, I thought it was stunning technique. Now, we know where he got the idea because he's given interviews about dynamic framing. That came from IMAX and split-screen IMAX. Where he got subliminal perception, possibly the same place where I got it, from the films in the late 50s and early 60s of Alain Resnais. In particular, his documentary Night and Fog about the concentration camps, and more importantly, Hiroshima Mon Amour, which was the most profound use of subliminal cuts I'd ever seen. Subliminal cutting is similar to an image that comes into your mind's eye, uninvited. You and I are talking here, and all of a sudden you might get a visual image of something else, completely different. And that's how the mind works. The mind is a gigantic file card system. And every once in a while, cards get plucked up out of, for no reason and out of sequence. Resnais used that technique in Hiroshima Mon Amour, and Fleischer used it very effectively in The Boston Strangler. And I had seen both those films before I did The Exorcist, because it was only a few years later that I directed The Exorcist and made graphic use of subliminal imagery. It came from Resnais via Fleischer.
Albert? Albert? Albert! Albert? Albert? Albert!